When you see a game like this between 19-year-old Alireza Firouzja and now 40-year-old Levon Aronian, a legend in the chess world, it begs the question, is Alireza Firouzja the greatest chess player of his generation? I think I might know the answer to that question. I'll leave it up to you to decide. This game was taken from the FTX Crypto Cup. It's a rapid game. Alireza Firouzja has white, Levon Aronian has black. Let's jump right in. Firouzja begins with e4. Aronian plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Spanish or Rui Lopez opening, and knight to f6. A Berlin defense. This is an invitation to play into a particular endgame here, as if white castled knight e4, this is sort of the position you get. And this is a very complex endgame, but black holds his own here. So Firouzja does not want to play into that. Instead, he plays d3, trying to keep the play in the middle game. Bishop to c5. Firouzja's taken here on c6 quite a bit. He doesn't do that, at least not yet. c3 is played instead. Castles, castles, rook to e8 to shore up the e5 pawn. And now bishop to g5. An annoying pin on the knight at f6. So Aronian plays a6, really pushing Firouzja to make a decision. Firouzja could play bishop to a4, keep it on the board, but instead he plays the move that he's most comfortable with and has played before. He takes the knight, and the pawn takes. You take with the d-pawn here away from the center because you want to free up that c8 bishop. So h3 keeps g4 under control. The knight can't jump in there. The bishop can't jump in there. The bishop retreats to f8. That looks strange. He's anticipating the d4 move. This is actually a very common place for the bishop in these structures. It might reemerge on g7 later. Queen to e2, queen to d6, knight b to d2, potentially jumping on that pawn at e5. Knight to d7 was played. Aronian could have played knight to h5 with the threat of hopping into f4. That also would have been a strong move. He plays knight to d7. The bishop moves to h4. Now, he anticipates black playing f6, but he's got another idea in mind with this early retreat of the bishop that doesn't make a lot of sense at first. We'll see why in a second. Aronian plays a5, keeping Firouzja from expanding on the queen side with b4. And now bishop to g3. So now we see what he's doing. He's attacking the e5 pawn and preparing to even play knight c4 and attack that pawn. And it would make sense to play f6 here, but Aronian doesn't do it, and I think it's probably because of this move, d4, and white gets a nice central position. So instead of that, Aronian plays b6, and now this bishop at c8 could develop at b7 or a6 later, but now knight to c4, putting maximum pressure on the pawn at e5. It is sufficiently defended for the moment, but only just. Queen to f6, and now knight f to d2. Unblocking the f2 pawn, so it can go to f4, open up the f file, and gain a tempo against the queen. b5 hits the knight, and the knight goes back to e3. The queen moves out of the way. Rook a to d1, moving the rook opposite the queen, and now a4. And you see Aronian, with the two bishops, is gaining quite a bit of space on the queen side, and white's position has a lot of latent potential with d4 and f4. But at the moment, Aronian is building a very interesting position. Now a3 is played to stop Aronian's queenside expansion, but it does create a weakness at b3. Knight to c5, attacking d3 twice with the queen and the knight. Knight to f3 in order to defend that pawn twice, and white still has not played a pawn break yet. f6, finally strengthening that position. Now queen to c2. If you play d4, the e4 pawn would fall. So he wants to support d4 later by defending e4. You still can't do it yet, but that's the idea long term. Bishop to e6. Aronian zeroes in on this weakness in Firouzja's position. The knight or the bishop, which would skewer the queen and the rook, could jump in there. d4 immediately. Now, that begs the question, why not bishop to b3 right here, skewering the queen and the rook? Well, that would actually be a mistake because of this move. Firouzja would play pawn takes knight, and that reveals the rook against the queen. And after bishop takes queen, rook takes queen, rook takes rook, knight takes c2, Firouzja would have two minor pieces for the rook, and he would actually be quite a bit better because with only one open file, he can control the entry points, and his minor pieces would be superior. Aronian also could take on d4, but after takes, bishop b3, again, just pawn takes knight, revealing the rook against the queen, and it's the same old story. So instead, knight to d7 was played, and c4 immediately. If he takes on e5, then bishop to b3, queen b1, and here knight to e5, piling up on the pinned knight on d7 would be the idea. So he always finds a tactical wrinkle to save himself from that bishop to b3 move. But now he plays c4, queen to e7, pawn takes e5, f5, and here he plays bishop takes e5. Perhaps a little stronger would be to take on b5 first. After pawn takes, now knight to d5, hitting the queen, as well as c7, bishop takes rook takes d5, and here white would have a total grip on the position. He takes on e5 with the bishop, still a strong move. And here, Aronian makes a mistake. He plays bishop takes h3. It looks like a strong idea. A knight takes e5 was probably the strongest option. Knight takes e5, queen to c5, knight to d7, bishop b7, rook d7. White is still better, but black is in the game. But he plays bishop h3 instead. The idea is if the pawn takes the bishop, then his knight would take the bishop on e5. And white's still okay here, but that would be a little bit better for him. But Firouzja makes the stronger move. Bishop takes c7. Now, by taking that pawn, it's not just that you get a pawn, it's that you get access to this d6 square. That's the real value in that capture. The bishop comes back to e6 now, bishop to d6, hitting the queen, and e5, sort of screwing that bishop right into that d6 square, hitting the queen, and obviously the bishop can't be taken because then the queen would be taken. So the queen has to move. Queen goes to h6, and now knight to d4. Look at that octopus knight, powerful, hitting b5, c6, threatening to exchange the bishop off. Go to f5 later, perhaps. Very powerful minor piece. Now bishop takes bishop, pawn takes, and knight to e5. Black is putting maximum pressure on c4. So pawn takes, and here Alireza decides to go ahead and get that bishop off the board. His knight was strong, but the bishop was strong too, and everything right now revolves around this d6 pawn. It's about getting that pawn up the board and to the queening square. If Aronian can stop it, he'll hold the position, but if Firouzja can get it through, he will win. Rook takes e6, and now f4, kicking the knight from its nice central position. The knight has to move. The knight goes back to f7, knight to f5, hitting the queen, defending the pawn. Maybe he can go into e7 with check, and after queen to f6, that is exactly what he does. Knight to e7 check, king to h8. Now the knight moves to d5, hitting the queen again. The queen goes to h4, and now queen to f5, hitting the rook and the knight. So Aronian, just like Firouzja was able to dodge those tactics on b3, Aronian does the same thing here. First of all, he plays rook to e2, hanging his f7 knight. Well, what happens if he takes? If queen f7, then queen to g3, and there's a threat of mate. It looks like he can't even get out of it. Actually, there is a way out. That's knight to e3. But then after queen takes e3 check, king to h2, white's still better, but black is in a better position than he was otherwise. So instead of taking that, Firouzja plays knight to c3, attacking the rook, and also allowing this rook to add to the defense of the d-pawn. In fact, if he takes, he would just lose. So rook to e3, and now d7. And remember, the knight is still hanging. What if white takes the knight here? Then this brilliant move from Aronian would have been the response. Rook to h3, threatening rook to h1 mate. And pawn takes rook would be forced, and then after queen g3, you'd have a perpetual check, and Aronian would escape with a draw. So instead of taking the knight, d7 is played, getting that pawn more close to the queening square, dangerously close. King to g8 defends the knight finally. Knight takes the pawn at b5, rook to d8, knight to d4. Now, the idea here is that he can go into c6, hit that rook at d8, and control the queening square. Knight to h6 is played by black, hitting the queen, queen to g5. And in this position, Aronian resigned. You see he's offering the exchange of queens as well as threatening the rook at d8. So the queens would have to be exchanged. And how would the game continue? Well, after queen takes, pawn takes, knight to f7, knight to c6, hitting the rook would be decisive. If the rook moved, you would just queen, then exchange, and he'd be up a clear minor piece in the endgame and would be winning. Now, even after going over this great game from Alireza Firouzja, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. To solve that problem, be sure to check out this game right here from Alireza Firouzja. I'm confident you're going to like it.